Racist manager. Throws black woman out of store, but he's shocked to learn she's the CEO. A store manager confronts a black woman in front of everyone, assuming she doesn't belong there. With a dismissive attitude, he humiliates her and throws her out, confident in his authority. But little does he know, the woman he just mistreated isn't just any customer. She's the CEO of the company that owns the store. You won't believe what happens when he realizes his mistake. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. Comment your location, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories that challenge injustice and inspire change. Stay tuned. This story is a powerful reminder of why we should never judge someone by their appearance. The store manager stood near the checkout counter, his sharp gaze darting across the room as he observed the flow of customers. His expression was stern, his posture rigid, exuding an air of authority. He prided himself on maintaining order in his store, convinced that his years of experience allowed him to spot trouble before it began. His eyes narrowed as he noticed a woman entering the store. She walked in with quiet confidence, her steps measured and deliberate. She was dressed in an elegant blazer and slacks, her presence subtle yet commanding. She moved through the store with an air of purpose, pausing occasionally to inspect the displays. Her calm demeanor drew glances from a few employees, but she seemed unfazed by the attention. The store hummed with activity. Soft music played in the background, and the murmur of customers filled the air. Displays of polished handbags and glimmering jewelry stood under warm lighting, creating a luxurious atmosphere. Employees moved quickly but quietly, their polite smiles masking subtle tension. The faint scent of leather and expensive perfume lingered in the air. The woman moved past the handbags, her gaze scanning the shelves thoughtfully. She picked up a leather wallet, running her fingers over the stitching as she examined it. To the manager, her actions didn't seem like those of a typical customer. His eyes followed her every move, suspicion growing with each passing second. She wasn't browsing aimlessly like the others. There was something about her presence that made him uneasy. He adjusted his tie, his jaw tightening as he decided to approach her. To him, she didn't fit the image of the store's usual clientele. He believed he was good at reading people, and everything about her, her confidence, her quiet observation of the store, seemed suspicious in his eyes. His assumptions began to fill in the blanks, convincing him that she didn't belong. The woman, unaware of his growing suspicion, continued to observe her surroundings. She noticed how employees interacted with customers, some smiling warmly, while others seemed more guarded. She paid attention to the placement of the displays and how the flow of the store encouraged movement. Her observations were deliberate, almost analytical, but her expression remained calm and neutral. Across the room, the manager frowned as he watched her linger near the jewelry section. To him, it looked like she was scoping the area, and his mind jumped to conclusions. Tightening his grip on the clipboard in his hand, he made his way toward her. "Excuse me," he said sharply, stopping a few feet away from her. His tone carried a sense of authority, as if he were speaking to an unruly employee rather than a customer. "Can I help you with something?" The woman turned to face him, her expression calm and composed. "No, thank you," she replied politely. "I'm just looking." Her response, though polite, didn't sit well with him. "Looking for what exactly?" he asked, his tone growing sharper. "You've been walking around for a while now." The subtle accusation in his words didn't escape her. She glanced at him briefly before turning her attention back to the display. "I'm just browsing," she said evenly. "Is there a problem?" Her calm response only fueled his irritation. "We've had some issues with people hanging around without making purchases," he said, his tone laced with condescension. "If you're not planning to buy anything, I'll have to ask you to leave." She paused, setting the wallet down carefully. "I wasn't aware that browsing was against store policy," she said, her voice steady and controlled. His frown deepened and he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't about policy. It's about making sure this store remains a safe and professional environment. If you're not here to shop, you need to leave." The tension between them was palpable, drawing the attention of a few nearby customers. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others slowed their movements, curious to see what was happening. The woman remained composed, her calm demeanor unshaken despite his words. "I don't believe I've done anything to make this environment unsafe or unprofessional," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm simply observing." "Observing?" he repeated, his tone dripping with skepticism. "What exactly are you observing?" She met his gaze steadily, her expression unreadable. "The quality of the products, the layout of the store, the interactions between staff and customers," she said matter-of-factly. "Is that a problem?" Her directness caught him off guard, but he quickly recovered. "Yes, it is," he said firmly. "If you're not here to shop, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We don't tolerate loitering." Her calm expression remained unchanged. "I see," she said quietly. "Well, you might want to reconsider how you treat people in your store. You never know who they might be." Her words carried a weight that gave him pause, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Is that supposed to mean something?" he asked, his voice laced with sarcasm. "It's just advice," she replied simply, her tone neutral. "Do with it what you will." The tension in the air was undeniable now, and the few onlookers who had paused to watch were visibly uncomfortable. The manager felt a flicker of doubt, but he pushed it aside, convinced he was in the right. He gestured toward the door. "Leave, now." The woman didn't move immediately. Instead, she looked at him for a long moment, her gaze steady and composed. "You're making a mistake," she said finally, her voice calm but firm. "And you're going to regret it." Her words lingered as she turned and walked toward the door, leaving the manager standing there, his pride still intact, but his confidence beginning to waver. The manager stood near the checkout counter, arms crossed, his frown deepening as he watched the woman head toward the door. Though she moved calmly, her parting words, "You're making a mistake, and you're going to regret it," echoed in his mind. He couldn't let it go. Something about her confidence felt like a challenge to his authority. Adjusting his tie, he called out sharply, his voice carrying across the store. "Wait a minute," he said, his tone sharp and commanding. The woman paused and turned slowly, her expression calm but questioning. The faint hum of conversations and music in the store seemed to fade, as a few employees and customers glanced over, sensing the tension. "Yes?" she asked evenly, her voice composed. The manager strode toward her, his shoes clicking against the polished floor. "I need to know what you were really doing in here," he demanded. "People don't just observe a store unless they're up to something." Her brow furrowed slightly, but her expression remained steady. "I was exactly what I said. Observing," she replied. "Is that a problem?" "Yes, it is," he said bluntly. "We've had issues with theft in this store, and frankly, you've been acting suspiciously." Her calm demeanor didn't falter, but there was a flicker of incredulity in her eyes. "Suspiciously," she repeated. "How, exactly?" "You've been wandering around without buying anything, looking at high-end items," he said dismissively. "People like you don't usually shop here." The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, and a hush seemed to fall over the store. Nearby employees exchanged uneasy glances, while a few customers froze mid-step, their curiosity drawn to the unfolding scene. One woman whispered to her friend, "Did he really just say that?" The woman took a slow breath, her expression unreadable. "People like me?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" The manager hesitated for a split second, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "You know what I mean," he said vaguely, his tone defensive. "You don't fit the profile of our typical customer." Her composure remained intact, but there was now a quiet intensity in her voice. "So, because I don't fit your profile, you've decided I don't belong here? Is that it?" "I'm just doing my job," he said, his tone growing more curt. "And part of my job is making sure this store stays safe and secure." "Safe and secure from what?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "From people who don't fit your assumptions of who belongs." A murmur rippled through the store. One of the employees behind the counter shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with the manager. A couple near the handbags exchanged a look, their disapproval evident. "Ma'am, I don't need to explain myself to you," the manager said, his voice rising slightly. "I have the authority here, and I've made my decision. If you're not here to shop, you need to leave, now." The woman's expression remained calm, but her words carried weight. "Your assumptions and decisions are based on prejudice, not fact," she said evenly. "And that's a dangerous way to run a business." The manager's face reddened, his frustration boiling over. "I don't need a lecture from you," he snapped. "You're wasting my time and everyone else's. Leave, or I'll have security escort you out." Her gaze didn't waver. "I've done nothing wrong," she said firmly. "I've been polite and respectful, and I've followed every rule of this store. What you're doing right now is harassment, plain and simple." The murmur among the customers grew louder. A young man near the checkout counter pulled out his phone, holding it discreetly as he began recording. Another customer, an older woman, whispered to her companion, "This is disgraceful." "He's completely out of line." The manager, oblivious to the growing attention, pointed toward the door. "If you don't leave immediately, I'll call security," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. The woman didn't move. Instead, she stood tall, her calm and collected demeanor a sharp contrast to his escalating anger. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. "And one day, you're going to look back on this moment with regret." Her words seemed to strike a nerve, but he refused to show it. "That's enough," he barked. "Leave, now." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes were on the two of them, as the tension reached its breaking point. The woman didn't argue further. She gave him one last look, a look that carried both disappointment and certainty, before turning and walking toward the door. As she reached the exit, the manager exhaled sharply, as if releasing the pressure of the encounter. He adjusted his tie again, glancing around the store with a sense of vindication. But the unease among the employees and customers was impossible to ignore. Their expressions weren't those of approval. They were of discomfort, disapproval, and disbelief. She didn't do anything wrong. An employee whispered to a coworker, "Why did he treat her like that?" The manager overheard but ignored it, convinced that he had handled the situation correctly. He didn't notice the customers quietly filming or the whispers spreading through the store. In his mind, the matter was settled, but it wasn't. What he didn't realize was that the woman he had just dismissed wasn't merely a customer. The truth about who she was, and the consequences of his actions, was about to turn his world upside down. The manager's gaze followed the woman as she reached the store's exit. Her calm demeanor in the face of his demands unnerved him, but his pride wouldn't let him show it. She pushed open the door, but then paused, letting it swing back as she turned to face him once more, her eyes locked with his, composed but firm. "I'm not leaving just because you assume I don't belong here," she said, her voice steady but resolute. "You have no valid reason to force me out of this store." Her words hit like a challenge, and the murmurs among employees and customers grew louder. The manager's face reddened, and he marched toward her, pointing at the door with exaggerated authority. "I don't need a reason beyond your behavior," he barked. "You've been wandering around, acting suspiciously, and ignoring my instructions. I have every right to remove you." "Acting suspiciously," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "You mean walking through your store and looking at merchandise? Isn't that what every customer here is doing?" "You know exactly what I mean," he shot back, his tone dripping with condescension. "Don't try to twist this around. I gave you a chance to leave quietly, but if you want to escalate this, fine. I'll call security and have them escort you out." The tension in the store was palpable now. Employees shifted nervously behind counters, some avoiding eye contact with the scene altogether, while others exchanged uneasy glances. Customers lingered nearby, whispering among themselves. One young woman near the jewelry counter muttered to her friend, "This is getting out of hand." "She hasn't done anything." The woman's expression remained calm, though her eyes narrowed slightly as she considered his words. "Security?" she said softly, as though testing the weight of the threat. "Do you really believe I've done something that warrants security intervention?" "You're refusing to comply with my instructions," the manager snapped, doubling down. "That's more than enough reason." The woman's gaze didn't waver. She took a small step forward, closing the distance between them. "What you're doing is discriminatory," she said evenly. "You're targeting me based on nothing more than your own assumptions, and instead of addressing the actual issues in your store, you've chosen to single me out." Her words carried a quiet authority that seemed to unnerve him, but he refused to back down. "Don't try to lecture me," he said, his tone rising. "I know how to run my store, and I know how to spot trouble." "Trouble," she repeated, her voice tinged with incredulity. "You've decided I'm trouble simply because I don't fit your idea of who should be shopping here. Is that what you mean by running your store?" The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. A man near the handbags section pulled out his phone, angling it discreetly to record the interaction. Another customer, a middle-aged woman, shook her head and whispered, "He's embarrassing himself." The manager's frustration boiled over, and he jabbed a finger toward the door. "I don't have to explain myself to you or anyone else," he said, his voice louder now. "I'm in charge here, and if I tell you to leave, you leave. End of story." The woman remained poised, her expression unwavering despite his increasingly aggressive tone. "You're in charge of this store," she said, her voice steady. "But that doesn't give you the right to treat people unfairly. Your authority comes with responsibility, and right now you're abusing it." Her words struck a chord, though he tried to shake it off. "I'm not going to stand here and argue with you," he said, reaching for the radio clipped to his belt. "Security will handle this." She raised her hand slightly, stopping him in his tracks. "Before you call security," she said calmly, "you might want to consider who you're dealing with." The manager froze for a moment, her words catching him off guard. He narrowed his eyes, his arrogance masking the flicker of doubt creeping in. "And who am I dealing with?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. She held his gaze, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Someone who has the authority to change everything about the way this store operates," she said, her voice firm but measured. and someone who won't tolerate the kind of behavior you've displayed today." Her statement hung in the air, heavy with implication. The manager's face faltered for the first time, the cracks in his confidence beginning to show. "What are you trying to say?" he asked. Though his voice had lost some of its edge, she took a slow breath, her calm expression never wavering. "I'm saying that you've made a serious mistake," she said, "and you're going to regret it." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, the tension in the air almost suffocating. Employees behind the counters whispered among themselves, their expressions ranging from curiosity to discomfort. One young man near the checkout counter said quietly to his coworker, "I think she's someone important." The manager, still clinging to his authority, straightened his posture. "I don't care who you think you are," he said, though his voice wavered slightly. "This is my store, and I make the rules here." "Is it?" she asked softly, her tone calm but pointed. "Are you sure about that?" Her question hung in the air like a thundercloud, and for the first time the manager hesitated. He glanced around, noticing the growing crowd of onlookers and the subtle shift in their expressions. The weight of the situation began to press down on him, though he refused to acknowledge it. "You'll find out soon enough," she said quietly, her words carrying a quiet power that sent a chill down his spine. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the door, leaving him standing in stunned silence. The store was eerily quiet now, the tension lingering long after she had left. Customers and employees alike exchanged looks, their unease palpable. The manager stood frozen, his thoughts racing as her parting words echoed in his mind. He didn't know it yet, but his world was about to change. The store had barely settled after the confrontation when the glass doors swung open again. The same woman who had been ordered to leave walked back in, her calm yet commanding presence immediately drawing attention. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, a sharply dressed assistant followed, carrying a leather portfolio and a confident stride. The manager's smug expression froze as he saw her return. "What are you doing back here?" he snapped, his voice a mix of anger and confusion. "I told you to leave." She ignored his tone, walking calmly toward the middle of the store, where several employees and customers had gathered, still murmuring about the earlier scene. Her composure was unshaken, and her eyes scanned the room before settling on the manager. "I believe it's time we address a few things," she said, her voice steady but filled with authority. The manager stepped forward, his posture stiff and defensive. "You have no right to come back in here after being told to leave," he said loudly, hoping to reassert control. "I'll have security remove you if I have to." The assistant stepped forward, opening the portfolio and pulling out a sleek business card. Without a word, they handed it to the manager. He snatched it, his frown deepening as he glanced at it. But as he read the name and title embossed on the card, the blood drained from his face. The name on the card matched the woman standing before him. Beneath it, in bold letters, was her title: Chief Executive Officer of the company that owned the retail chain. His hands trembled slightly as he looked back at her, his arrogance crumbling in an instant. You're the CEO," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, her expression calm but unyielding. "That's correct," she said. "And I oversee not just this store, but every location under this company's name." The room fell silent. The employees behind the counters froze, their eyes wide with shock. Customers whispered among themselves, their voices filled with awe and disbelief. One employee muttered under their breath, "I knew she seemed important." The manager's face turned pale, and his posture sagged as the weight of his actions hit him. I didn't know," he stammered, his tone desperate. "I had no idea." She raised a hand, silencing him. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know," she said, her voice steady but cutting. "You made assumptions based solely on my appearance. You didn't stop to think that I might be more than the narrative you created in your head." His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The authority he had clung to so tightly was gone, replaced by regret and panic. The woman turned slightly, addressing the employees who had watched the scene unfold. "To everyone here," she said, her voice carrying across the store, "this is not the kind of environment I have worked so hard to create. I built this company on the principles of respect, inclusivity, and fairness. What I witnessed today was a direct violation of those values." The employees listened intently, some nodding in agreement. One of them, a younger cashier, stepped forward hesitantly. "We're so sorry," they said quietly. "We didn't know how to step in." "It's not just about stepping in," she replied gently, her tone softening. "It's about creating a culture where situations like this don't happen in the first place." She turned back to the manager, who was now visibly sweating. His shoulders hunched as he avoided her gaze. "Your actions today were unacceptable," she said firmly. "You treated me as though I didn't belong, as though I were beneath you, without any justification beyond your own prejudice." I didn't mean to," he started, but his voice trailed off. "It doesn't matter what you meant," she interrupted. "What matters is what you did. And what you did was humiliate me in front of your staff and customers without cause. That is not the behavior of a leader. That is the behavior of someone who should not be in a position of authority." The murmurs among the crowd grew louder. Customers nodded in agreement, and a few even clapped softly. The assistant stepped forward again, handing the manager a folder. He took it with shaking hands, his eyes darting nervously between her and the papers. "These are the reports of today's incident, gathered from witnesses and employees," she explained. "They will be forwarded to Human Resources and the board for review. You will be placed under immediate suspension while we determine the appropriate course of action." The manager's face fell, his confidence shattered. "Please," he said weakly, his voice barely audible. "I didn't realize who you were. If I had known—" "If you had known, you would have treated me differently," she interrupted, her voice sharp. "That's exactly the problem. Your treatment of people shouldn't depend on who they are or what they do. Respect should be given to everyone, not just those you perceive as important." Her words silenced him completely. He lowered his head, unable to meet her eyes. She turned to the employees once more, her tone softening slightly. "This store, and every store in this company, should be a place where everyone feels valued and respected, customers and employees alike. That's the standard I expect, and it's the standard we're going to uphold moving forward." The employees nodded, their expressions a mix of relief and admiration. One of them, the cashier from earlier, stepped forward again. "Thank you," they said quietly, "for standing up for what's right." She smiled faintly, her composure unwavering. "It's not just about standing up," she said. "It's about creating real change. And that's what we're going to do." The tension in the room began to lift as the employees and customers absorbed the gravity of the moment. The manager, now visibly defeated, remained silent as she turned to leave. Her assistant followed, their steps echoing through the quiet store. As the doors swung shut behind her, the employees exchanged glances, their respect for her clear. The manager, meanwhile, stood frozen, the full weight of his actions settling on his shoulders. The tables had turned, and justice was finally being served. The store was quieter than usual the next morning, the buzz from the previous day's incident still lingering in the air. The manager's absence was conspicuous, his desk in the back office now empty. Word had quickly spread that he had been placed on suspension pending further review, and employees couldn't help but reflect on the consequences of his actions. The atmosphere was a mix of relief and uncertainty, but for most, there was a clear sense that justice was being served. The woman, on the other hand, had returned to her office. She didn't revel in the manager's downfall or celebrate his suspension. Instead, she spent her morning reviewing company policies and drafting an email to the executive team, outlining a comprehensive plan for workplace equality training. For her, the incident wasn't just about one manager's actions. It was a wake-up call for the entire organization. "This isn't about punishment," she said during a virtual meeting with her leadership team later that afternoon. "It's about education and accountability. If we want to create an inclusive environment, we need to actively work toward it. That means addressing biases at every level and holding ourselves to higher standards." Her words carried the same grace and conviction she had shown in the store. She wasn't focused on seeking revenge or making an example out of the manager. Instead, her attention was on ensuring that no one else would have to experience what she had. Back at the store, employees were having candid conversations about the events of the previous day. A young cashier who had witnessed the incident spoke up during a team meeting. "It made me realize how easy it is to overlook things like this," she admitted. "I saw what was happening, but I didn't know how to step in or if it was my place to say anything." Another employee nodded. "Same here," he said. "I've always thought of myself as someone who treats everyone fairly, but seeing what happened made me realize I need to be more proactive." Their manager for the day, a temporary replacement from another location, listened carefully, encouraging the discussion. "These are important conversations to have," she said. "We all have biases, whether we realize it or not. What matters is how we address them and what we do to create a better environment moving forward." The employees began brainstorming ideas, from hosting monthly workshops to creating an anonymous feedback system where concerns could be raised without fear of retaliation. The event had sparked something within them, a desire to do better, to ensure their workplace reflected the values the company claimed to uphold. Meanwhile, customers who had witnessed the incident shared their thoughts online. Videos of the confrontation had gone viral, and the overwhelming response was one of support for the woman and her actions. Comments flooded in, many applauding her composure and grace in the face of discrimination. "She handled it so professionally," one user wrote. "We need more leaders like her who don't just talk about change, but actually make it happen." Another commenter added, "This is a reminder that we need to be more aware of our own biases. It's not enough to say we're against discrimination, we have to actively fight it." For the manager, the suspension gave him time to reflect on his actions. Sitting alone in his small apartment, he replayed the events of that day over and over in his mind. The woman's words haunted him, particularly her reminder that respect should be universal, not dependent on someone's perceived importance. He realized how deeply his biases had influenced his behavior and how his arrogance had blinded him to the harm he was causing. It wasn't an easy journey, but the manager began taking steps toward change. He enrolled in a cultural sensitivity course, not because it was required, but because he wanted to better understand the prejudices he had carried for so long. He also reached out to the company's HR department, expressing his willingness to participate in any programs aimed at fostering inclusivity. When the woman received a message from him weeks later, she read it carefully. It was an apology, not just for his actions, but for the mindset that had led to them. "I realize now how much damage I've done, not just to you, but to everyone who witnessed my behavior," he wrote. "I'm committed to changing and ensuring this never happens again." She appreciated the gesture but didn't let it distract her from her larger mission. The changes she had proposed to the executive team were already underway. Training programs were being scheduled, policies were being revised, and employees at all levels were being encouraged to engage in open dialogue about bias and discrimination. It was a step forward, and while there was still much work to be done, it was progress. At the next company-wide meeting, she addressed the entire organization. The events of the past few weeks have reminded us all of the importance of accountability, she said. But accountability isn't about punishment. It's about learning, growing, and creating a culture where everyone feels valued and respected. Her words were met with applause, not just because of her position, but because of the sincerity behind them. She wasn't just a leader. She was an example of the kind of change she wanted to see in the world. The store, where it all began, underwent its own transformation. Employees were more attentive, more supportive of one another, and more mindful of how they interacted with customers. The temporary manager, impressed by their willingness to grow, made a point to highlight their efforts during weekly reports to the corporate office. And while the original manager's future with the company remained uncertain, the lessons he learned stayed with him. He knew he had been given a second chance, not to reclaim his position, but to become a better person. The woman's actions had created a ripple effect, inspiring change far beyond the walls of that single store. Her grace, composure, and determination served as a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right isn't just about confronting injustice. It's about building a better future for everyone. As the company moved forward with its renewed commitment to inclusivity, one powerful lesson stood out. Judging someone by their appearance can blind us to their true worth. Only through respect and understanding can we break the barriers of prejudice. The woman's composure and leadership in the face of injustice served as a reminder that change starts with each of us, not just in what we say, but in how we act. Now, we turn the question to you. Have you ever judged someone too quickly? How did you learn from that experience? Share your story in the comments below. It's through these conversations that we can inspire one another to grow and do better. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more impactful tales that shed light on injustice, inspire change, and celebrate resilience. Together, we can create a ripple effect of understanding and compassion. Thank you for watching and being part of this journey toward a more inclusive world. See you in the next story, where we continue to uncover truths that inspire and challenge us all. Until then, remember, change starts with you.